I've been working in test prep for pretty much my whole career. I've taught and written materials for more than 10 different standardized tests, but SAT and ACT were the ones that I started with. They're the ones I keep coming back to, and so they have a really special place in my heart. And I live in Seattle, Washington with my husband and my 2 cats, who you can see right here. So in today's session, we're going to hit a bunch of different topics related to balancing test prep with a busy schedule, but a couple of things that we're going to hit on in particular: how much time do you need to devote to test prep, how early should you start, and how to balance school, sports, clubs, a social life alongside test prep. And like Jessica mentioned, this is something that comes up over and over and over again in our interactions with students and parents. So it's a really important topic. So I'm glad you can be here. All right. So going ahead and jumping in with the first tip for balancing test prep and your life, which is to set a realistic score goal and timeline. And this is the first tip because it's the most important thing to do right off the bat. In my experience in working with students for any test, not specifically just the SAT and the ACT, but for any test, the score goal that I hear the most frequently has either got to be as good as I can do or a perfect score. And while I appreciate the attitude behind that, trying to do your absolute best, it's not a particularly helpful score goal. One, because it sets you up for failure and sets your child up for failure because you can never do your best, and rarely are you going to get a perfect score. But two, because it doesn't really help you with setting a realistic timeline, with making a study plan, and with figuring out if you're making the desired progress toward that goal. So it's really important to have a number, a realistic number that you're shooting for. Now, in order to set that score goal, a really good move here is to use the average scores at your target schools. So taking your school list, which should have, a safety school, maybe a reach school or two, but mostly schools where you're right around the 50th percentile of students who are admitted. So that's kind of the zone that you want to shoot for. So taking that list of schools, looking at those middle schools, going, okay, what is the 50th percentile score for admitted students? And that's a really good goal score. If you want to shoot a little bit higher, you could go for like a 75th percentile there, but that's going to help you get a really solid score that's going to help you achieve the goals that you're looking to achieve. So once you have that score goal, that number, you're halfway there. At that point, we want to make sure that we have a baseline score to compare against it. And the best way to get one of these is to take a full-length, realistic practice test. Now, there are 8 of these for free from College Board for SAT. For ACT, I forget the exact number, but I think it's like 4 or 5 that you can find online, again, for free. So there are options here. And then we want to take this as realistically as possible, all in one sitting, just so that you have the best baseline possible. If your child's already taken an official test, that's great. You can use that as your baseline. Now, once you have those 2 pieces, now you have where you're starting and where you want to go, and you can see the difference between those scores. Now, I've got a little bit of data here, and I want to just preface this by saying this is not perfect. It's not going to be true for every single situation, but it is a good, just logical check, reality check for how realistic the score improvement you're looking for is in the timeline that you're shooting for. So this is based on about 10 hours of study per week on average. So again, that's just kind of a guideline. So for ACT, if you're looking for a 3-point improvement, you're probably looking at a 1 to 2 month study timeline. So not super long there, but it gets you about 3 points. 5 to 6 point improvement, you're looking at a little bit longer, maybe 3 to 4 months. And if you're looking for a large score improvement, like 7 to 10 points, you're probably looking at a 6 to 12 month or potentially even multiple year study journey for that large of a score improvement. For SAT, it's a very similar situation. So for SAT, you've got 70 to 150 points is probably going to be about 1 to 2 months. 150 to 250 is probably about 3 to 4 months. And then 250 to 350 is going to be more like 6 to 12 months. So if you are looking at this and you're going, okay, great, the score improvement we're looking for aligns with this timeline, that's awesome. It's usually a good idea to have the ability to take a retake, just in case something goes wrong, the score doesn't come out the way you want it to, or your child gets sick, or something happens that prevents that test day from being what you want it to be. But overall, that's awesome. Now, if you're finding that the score improvement you're looking for does not align with the timeline that you have, something's got to give. I find that a lot of students that I work with think that if they just study more and more and more and more and really cram in like 20 hours of study per week, that they're going to be able to speed up this timeline significantly. And in my experience, while you can maybe get another point on the ACT out of it, or 30, 40 points on the SAT out of it, it's not a great plan of action. I find that most frequently when my students are trying to accomplish a much larger score improvement in a much shorter amount of time, they end up burnt out, they end up frustrated, and they end up spending a lot of study time really ineffectively, which is actually something that we'll talk about in some of these other tips. So my really strong recommendation is to, even though these are not perfect and aren't necessarily going to apply perfectly to every single student, using them as a guideline for what's going to be realistic. So you may want to plan on taking a later test date, or just decide now that you're okay with a retake. Or potentially, if that timeline is non-negotiable, you may want to adjust your expectations for that score and potentially adjust your school list accordingly. And the benefits of this are that your student has a chance at success, which can really reduce the stress of the situation, but that the actual study schedule is going to be realistic for attaining that sort of score improvement. Okay, with that out of the way, let's start talking about the test prep itself. So once you have that timeline set, once you have that score goal, now it's time to execute on that. So my first tip here is to plan your weekly study schedules in advance. So started at the full test timeline, now bringing it down to the weekly level. So the thing that I like to tell my students is that things that are on the calendar are a priority. I think it's Stephen Covey in 7 Habits for Highly Effective People who talks about filling a jar up with rocks. If you put a bunch of little rocks in and then try to put big rocks on top of it, the big rocks won't fit, right? So you want to put your big rocks in, and then the little rocks will filter around it. So the idea being prioritizing the things that are important, right? Well, school goes on the calendar, sports go on the calendar, family events go on the calendar, but I find that very frequently test prep does not go on the calendar. And the expectation is that it'll just kind of filter in around all those bigger events. But because folks are thinking of it as a little rock, if there are too many big rocks or too many other little rocks, it doesn't happen and it gets deprioritized, and something that should be a priority, should be a big rock, ends up not really happening. And so even the study timelines on the previous slide aren't realistic because we're not getting anywhere close to 10 hours a week. So my recommendation is to make test prep a big rock and put it on the calendar so that there is a time set aside for that test prep and it's consistent so that the student can expect it and so that your child can plan around it, and that it doesn't feel like this ever-present burden of something that should be done at all times. There is a dedicated time for it to happen. So that recommendation of about 10 hours per week is going to help you meet those guidelines on the previous slide. That's going to be a really solid amount of time to achieve a significant amount of learning in a week and then build on that leading up to your test day. That said, that is not a realistic amount of time for some students who are particularly busy. Totally understand that. I'm going to recommend a minimum of 5 hours a week. Now, I find when students do less than 5 hours a week, they end up with these really far spaced apart study sessions, and these study sessions where not a lot gets learned. And I find that the students, even though they are putting in some time, and it definitely feels like a pressure of studying, there isn't a lot of improvement. With at least 5 hours a week, you're getting enough study in that you're able to build on that previous knowledge. You're studying frequently enough that you're able to consolidate information that you've learned before and then build upon it and retain that knowledge. So minimum 5, 10 is going to be really great. Some students can push up to maybe 15, but I wouldn't recommend ever going really above like 20 in a week. And that would only be something I would recommend in the summer if you've got very little else going on. I find that with much higher than that, the study quality really drops off, and students end up making the same mistakes over and over again, end up building bad habits, and it just ends up being a really frustrating experience and can cause that student to burn out and lose steam before they get to their test day. So this is, again, a guideline. It's going to depend a little bit on your student, but if you are going, okay, we're going a little less than 10 hours per week, you might want to go with a longer study timeline accordingly. If you're going a little more than 10 hours per week, you might be able to shave off a little bit of time, but I wouldn't imagine that you'd shave off a ton, because some of that is just giving your brain time enough to process and time enough to build the connections it needs. So once you've got those hours set aside, it's time to figure out, okay, when are those hours going to happen? And that leads me to this bullet point, which is consistency over cramming. A lot of students really want to do all of their study in one day or in 2 days, and particularly on the weekends. And yes, the weekends are great, but if you're studying only on the weekends, that's going to really decrease the mileage that you're getting out of that study. Because if you're spending 7 whole days not studying and then spending a whole 7 days not studying, there's a really good chance you're going to forget everything you've learned between those study sessions. And then your child's going to end up reviewing stuff over and over again, making the same mistakes, building bad habits. And then one study session is so long that, again, the quality drops off and it doesn't end up being particularly productive. So my recommendation is to spread your study over 4 to 6 hours per week. And again, this is something that you can help your student with prioritizing. So helping sitting them down with their calendar, going when is going to be a good time for you to commit to studying. Different students find different things effective. Some students are going to study every single weekday and then totally take weekends off, or study every single weekday for a little bit less time and then study one weekend day. Some students are going to study a couple of times during the week, but not a ton, and then really commit on Saturday and Sunday. It's going to depend on your student schedule, but again, making sure that it is spread throughout the week as much as you can is going to increase the value on a weekly level, but also on an individual session level. And then the last thing here is quality over quantity. So we've kind of hinted at this idea that more study isn't always better, and that longer study isn't always better. But it also has to do with where that study is happening and how focused that study is. One of the things that we have at Magoosh is an app, and that app is awesome for stuff like on the go, on the bus, and that's great, again, for specific types of study. But the test itself requires a pencil, paper, and uninterrupted focus for hours at a time. That means that some of your students' study should have a pencil, a paper, and uninterrupted focus for at least 20 minutes. We're probably looking at a couple of study sessions a week that are at least an hour long. And that's, again, just going to make sure that the study is high quality, but that it also deals with some of the things that your student will be experiencing on test day. So it's realistic to that experience. All right, so Once that is on the calendar, you've got that booked, and you might have the same schedule every week. It might be different depending on the week. We're going to look at the actual study sessions themselves. So bringing that scope in even further. We want to make sure that the study sessions that we have on the calendar are actually effective for your student. Now, we've done some things working in our favor here, making sure they're not too long, making sure that they're focused, all of that good stuff. But we also want to make sure that what we're doing in those study sessions is going to get us the most benefit. So the first thing that I want to note is that there are high and low frequency concepts on the SAT and the ACT. And the more your student focuses on high frequency concepts, the more points they're going to get for their study time. I can't tell you how many students come to me and they say they've been working really, really hard on vocab. When vocab is really not tested on either the SAT or the ACT, and when it is tested, it's less about memorizing meanings of words and more about being able to interpret what a word is doing in a given sentence in context. Similarly, I have students who come to me and saying they've been studying idioms when again, they're really infrequent, saying that they've been reviewing high school science concepts when like 2 questions on ACT science are going to be focused on that, focused on trig for ACT or SAT math, when again, that is the lowest frequency concept and your child is probably better off focusing on more algebraic concepts. All of this to say, making sure that your student is focusing their time on the stuff that actually shows up on the exam and shows up with some level of frequency on the exam is going to help them get more out of their studies. So they don't have to study as much in order to get more benefit. One way to do this more easily is to sign up for a class or some sort of program that's going to ensure that your child is focusing on these things. So for instance, the live SAT and ACT classes that we do at Magoosh, I've handpicked concepts for them that are going to be more frequently tested and that are going to show up in more frequency. So as a result, we spend more of our time on the stuff that's going to get your student more points and less time on stuff that's just going to take forever to learn and that isn't going to get them as many points. Now, while there are high frequency concepts, that doesn't mean that every student should be studying the exact same thing. Because if one topic is high frequency, but your child totally understands it and is never going to miss a question on it, they shouldn't be spending their time with it, except for in timed practice and on practice tests. They should be focusing their energy on things that they are missing. So making sure that your student's study is customized to them is going to be particularly effective. So there are a few different ways to approach this, but in general, just encouraging your student to keep track of what they're doing well, what they're not doing as well on, and then having them focus their energies accordingly is going to, again, just really help them to get more mileage out of the time that they spend and not have them run into the situation where they absolutely need a retake because they spent their study time ineffectively. Which actually leads me to my last point, which is review over drilling. I find that a lot of students really think that same kind of quantity over quality mindset where they're going, hey, I'm going to go and do 100 questions and then I'm done. And that's actually really ineffective. While there is some benefit from doing the questions, you're going to get the same amount of benefit from going back and looking at the questions that you've missed. So rather than drilling another 100 questions, going back and really closely reviewing the 20 questions that you missed is going to help you improve. 1, going to help you not make that same mistake again. 2, and then 3, figure out what you should be focusing your energy on in your next study session. So it helps you to address those personal areas of improvement. So rather than setting goals around how many questions you want to get done or how many questions your student wants to get done, help them to set goals around reviewing, around improvement, and then make sure that they're updating those goals as they go. Another really great tool here is maybe saying there's one study session for drilling, and then the next day is a study session for reviewing. Or maybe the first half hour is for doing questions. The second half hour in one study session is for reviewing those questions. A good kind of rule of thumb is spending maybe about 50% of your time on that review. That can just, again, help your student get more mileage out of their time. All right. And this leads me to test prep tip number 4. Now, most of the study sessions are going to be doing lessons or doing problems. It depends on where and how your student is studying. If they're studying in Magoosh, it'll probably be doing lessons, video lessons, and then following up with quizzes and practice, and then looking at those explanations, watching explanation videos, following up on those sorts of things, taking notes, et cetera, et cetera. But that is not going to be it, because a really important part of a student's study journey is going to be practice tests. And when I say practice tests, I mean every 2 to 4 weeks, full-length official practice tests. So the same thing that your student would have done to get their baseline score before deciding on their timeline, their score goal, et cetera, et cetera. So this might seem like a lot, and it's definitely going to depend on your student's timeline. So if you're looking at a few months until your test date, something like every 2 to 3 weeks is going to be totally realistic. You're likely not going to run out of practice tests. If you're looking at a much longer timeline for a larger score goal, you might want to go with that every 4 weeks mark, just again, so you don't run out of practice tests, and you definitely have some for right before the test when it really counts. Now, there's a couple of benefits to taking these practice tests. So benefit number 1 is you're going to be able to see if you're making the required progress toward that score goal. And then you and your student can adjust accordingly, whether or not that study is particularly effective, whether or not you want to change that timeline, whether or not you want to change that goal, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe more importantly, it's going to give your student the kind of test day experience that they'll have on test day. So it will bring in elements of endurance. It'll bring in elements of testing anxiety. It'll bring in elements of timing and pacing that we just don't see in regular practice, even if we are doing some timed regular practice. So a lot of students are hesitant to do this because they're going, I haven't learned everything yet. Why would I take a practice test? Part of it is for that learning experience to see, hey, am I able to do what I do in my study on a test? And am I able to overcome some of those hurdles that come with that testing environment around timing, anxiety, endurance, et cetera, so that on test day, I'm not surprised by something I didn't run into in my practice. So every 2 to 4 weeks, this is again something that I'm really going to recommend scheduling in advance. So when you're setting up your weekly study goals, I recommend actually scheduling all of these practice tests in advance when you're setting that timeline. A really great way to do this is to plan your last practice test for a week before your exam or your student's exam, and then again every 2 to 4 weeks back from there. This is a pretty big time commitment. These practice tests are about 4 hours in length. So it's hard to, again, fit it in around other activities. So just planning in advance when those are going to happen helps make them a priority, helps make them expected, so that it's going to be easier to get them done. The other thing here is that these practice tests should be as realistic as possible. So that means official or from a trusted source like Magoosh, but it also means all in one sitting. I find that a lot of students and parents try to break up practice tests by section or do half one day, half another day. And that's definitely better than nothing, but it's probably a better idea to postpone the practice test a week and do it all in one sitting than to do that unrealistic experience. Because again, you're not going to get that same practice with the endurance, with the anxiety, with the timing, blah, 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 that you would in a realistic test if you are spreading it across multiple days. But also because it'll often give an inflated score because those things aren't coming into play. And then students can have unrealistic expectations that they're not able to live up to on test day. So again, really important to schedule it in advance because that is a significant block of time. And then the other part of why it's so important to schedule in advance is because it should always be followed by review. Just like drilling 100 questions and then going, cool, I'm done, is not particularly helpful. Doing a practice test and then not following it up with serious review is missing out on half of the benefit of that practice test. So I really recommend setting aside the day after that practice test. So usually like a Saturday, Sunday practice test, Sunday review, and setting aside a couple of hours. So a longer study session to go back through, look at those mistakes, take notes on them, maybe do an error log so that you can get all of the benefits from it. So it's a pretty hefty weekend, but it again has more benefit than just doing a bunch of study and not testing on it. So based on how that review goes, you can then adapt your study plan based on the results. Maybe you're finding out that what you're studying isn't particularly effective, or you're finding out that maybe your students' study environment isn't working for them, or that their study schedule isn't something they're actually sticking to, or you're finding out that maybe actually you're going to need more time to achieve that score improvement you're looking for. It's better to know that earlier so that you can plan around it than find out on test day. So prioritizing practice tests and scheduling those as early as possible is just going to help, again, get so much more mileage out of your prep. So recapping, takeaways there, my big tips are to set a realistic score goal and timeline so that your student knows what they're aiming for and so that that goal is achievable for them. Then, based on that timeline, plan a realistic weekly study schedule. So based on their activities, what they have going on in their lives, making sure that they're committing a reasonable amount of time, at least 5 hours, maybe more like 10 hours per week to their study. And that's set aside in advance so they don't have to think about it. Making sure that those study sessions are structured for learning, so not too long, not too short, but that they're going to be prioritizing the things that are most important for the test and for your students, particularly review of mistakes. And then finally, prioritizing practice tests as part of this study schedule every 2 to 4 weeks, a full-length sit-down exam.